Warning, this content is for entertainment and educational purposes only. This video is brought to you by First Detachment Nutrition. Battle tested, expert formulated. Use discount code AB10 at checkout for 10% off. All right, folks, Big Paul here today with Kurt Havens. We're going to dig into the science of testosterone, the parent male hormone, probably the most important hormone if you want to be a man, right? More important than nandrolone. I always laugh when I hear guys talking about doing nandrolone-only cycles. It's always a curious thing to me that dudes think that's, I mean, I guess they did it in the 70s or whatever, but
no, like, they usually use D-ball with it for estrogen.
Right. That was your testosterone base. But so let's dig into some history of testosterone.
Okay, so it was isolated in 1935 and on the market in 1936. And as soon as they isolated it, it was like this mad rush for all the pharmaceutical companies in Europe to get this thing produced. And the two scientists that actually first isolated it actually won a Nobel Prize. Just kind of crazy if you think about the way testosterone is viewed nowadays versus how it was viewed in the 1930s.
That's
right?
Crazy.
It becomes this ostracized thing if you use it, but yet these guys were the most brilliant scientists in the world. So some basics, it has a 100 of 100 anabolic to androgenic rating. It's kind of the benchmark. Most drugs are based on that as a standard. 95% of, so we're just talking about men, basically. Women is like another call. 95% naturally is produced in the testicles of a man.
Not in my testicles, Kurt.
Yeah, no, in a natural man. So 5 to 7% is 5-alpha reduced to DHT. But once it is 5-alpha DHT, 10% of the circulating hormone in your body, 10% of testosterone in a ratio would be DHT. So the concentration of DHT is 1/10 DHT.
Yeah, I'd always heard 10%, but that varies. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that varies from person to person.
Yeah,
right?
These are just averages. Unfortunately, medicine is based on averages, so it's not always accurate. And then about 0.3% is aromatized to estradiol, which again is going to vary, right? That's based on averages, and that's in natural people.
Right, and then also from correct me if I'm wrong here, but that also is dependent upon, from what I've seen, body fat percentages too. So the fatter you are, the more you aromatize.
Yep, that's the enzyme is mostly there, and in the brain, there's a large percent as well. Yeah, and so that statistic, the 0.3, it specifically says 19 to 39-year-old non-obese males, because it's a different rate, obviously, in obese people. Its structure is pretty straightforward. It has a ketone at carbon 3 and a hydroxyl group at carbon 7, and then an ester can be attached. An interesting way to look at steroids too that's not so typical is to divide them into class 1 and class 2. I don't know if you've ever heard that before.
No, I've never heard that one before. That's
class
a new one.
Class 1 would be binding with the androgen receptor, and class 2 are drugs that don't. So like D-ball and Anadrol would be class 2, and class 1 would be something like Trenbolone that pretty much only works through the AR, right? So testosterone would then be considered to have mixed activity because it does both. So it's one of the few drugs that kind of has both. So you would have what we would consider genomic response, which is testosterone binds to the androgen receptor, goes to the cytoplasm, can become DHT or stay as testosterone, and then go into the nucleus and cause gene transcription. Or it can bind to a cellular, like the outside of the cell, it's a receptor there, and not enter the cell and cause other effects that are considered non-genomic, meaning not related to gene expression.
And what would be non-genomic effects? Some examples.
Like aggression.
Aggression, okay.
Any of the neurological effects, other non-genomic effects. Mostly those kind of things, and they're experienced within seconds. As soon as it reaches a cell, versus like a genomic effect could take hours, days, weeks to actually build up. It is also a neurosteroid, so it's a positive regulator of GABA on its own. Inside the human brain, though, for men, estrogen is actually the primary hormone that dictates how our brain works. Just kind of interesting. So
yeah, that is interesting.
Testosterone. So our brain is more formed by estrogen than testosterone.
I do know I always feel better when I'm running a testosterone base. I've tried nandrolone only cycles. Believe me, I've done everything, all the stuff that people get angry when I with me when I talk about, doing this or doing that. And I've tried it all, but I always feel the best when I'm running a testosterone base.
Yeah. And it'd be like if you had to run a gram of something, right? You know that if you're running a gram of test, you're at least going to feel good.
Right.
And your health isn't going to be compromised.
Well, it's pretty clear what the metabolites are and how it's going to affect you with testosterone.
Yeah. But it's so interesting still that it's been around that long and we still don't know everything there is to know about it. There was a large period of time where it was not studied at all from the late 70s until the mid 90s. It basically was shelved and no one looked at it.
That's crazy.
There was a scientist in the 90s with the last name Bazin, and he was the first one basically to revisit these things. And in 1996, he did a study where he did a graded dose response in young, healthy men. And he basically was the one that proved to the medical community that testosterone grew muscle in a dose-dependent fashion.
Yeah, wasn't it the old belief was that it didn't have any effect on muscle growth?
Yeah, some of the old textbooks that I have state that it blocked cortisol and it just worked through anti-catabolic mechanisms and had no actual, anabolic effect, which is wild. And this was like in the 70s.
Yeah.
And so in 1996, so that kind of changed at least that aspect of endocrinology forever. After he showed this, then it opened up the door for a lot of other stuff. That's when they went back and they looked at MENT, Testosterone and stuff. After they realized this, they were like, wait a second, there's other compounds that might do this as well. So your free testosterone is what is in the blood that is not bound to anything. It is literally free. And in theory, it's what is going to bind to the androgen receptor. That's not 100% the case. So you have basically the majority is bound to albumin. It's produced in the liver, and that is not available at all. That's basically blocked from your body to use. And then there's, the second largest, percent is by sex hormone binding globulin. And that is a transport hormone similar to cholesterol. So it helps transport to the cell. And the sex hormone binding globulin also has its own receptor that can mediate some effects. And that testosterone that's bound to sex hormone binding globulin is considered bioavailable. It's not free, but it's still usable. So that's kind of changed in recent. They used to think it was just the free testosterone that mattered. So technically the stuff that's bound to sex hormone binding globulin matters as well, right? So there's some kind of confounding stuff where people want to crash sex hormone binding globulin, get as low as possible to make more free. That also increases the rate which it's excreted.
Yeah, the dogma or the belief that I'd always heard is that you wanted SHBG low to increase free testosterone to actually have more usable testosterone. That's what I had always heard, but that doesn't seem to be true.
Yeah, to an extent. I think the problem is the more testosterone someone uses, the lower the sex hormone binding globulin is going to go anyway. So you don't really have to. I would advise most people to just let the body do its thing with it. The more free there is, the less bound to sex hormone binding globulin, the faster it's going to go back to the liver and get broken down to a diol and excreted. So you don't really want to crash that either.
Yeah, although everybody that runs PEDs, at least from what I've seen, especially DHT-derived PEDs, pretty much has crashed SHBG from what I've seen.
Yep. Yeah. So in theory, you're excreting more hormone than than you can necessarily use. In theory,
I guess if you're blasting a ton of stuff, it probably doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. Yeah, and if you're pinning all the time too, right? So there's other ways to like manage it too. I think if you pin infrequently in large doses, you're going to have higher sex hormone binding globulin because the body doesn't know what to do with that big bolus. Versus if you pinned every day, it's going to naturally be lower because it mimics more of like the body's like natural production.
Right.
So you can kind of manage that on your own without adding other things like proviron in there.
So people are probably largely overthinking the SHBG stuff. Then if you're taking enough, it probably doesn't matter.
I would say it's irrelevant. I think it's like you said something to me a while ago that really stuck with me. It's the people that are worrying about the 5% when the 95% isn't taken care of. But it's like, if really your biggest concern in your cycle is the free testosterone, it's not the fact that your diet is total crap. Very, very few people that I've met, that's really a concerning thing, right? I mean, there's better things to focus on than.
Usually when I see people get focused on the little stuff, they're not making any progress. They're so caught up in the minutia that they have totally lost sight of the bigger picture things. So stuff like that. I can tell you that most bodybuilders, I'm sure Ronnie Coleman wasn't thinking about his SHBG.
I don't think he'd even know what it was.
No, probably not. And correct me if I'm wrong, the total testosterone levels, like people get completely consumed with their total testosterone levels. Is it even really relevant?
Not necessarily, right? Because a lot of that's bound to albumins. You can't use it.
Right.
Yeah.
I've always thought it was irrelevant that free testosterone probably matters more.
Yeah. I mean, I would say if the total though is, in the 200 or 300s, I'd be concerned about the total.
Right.
Total is 600. I'd be more concerned to see where the free was. Right. So the standard range that's, accepted in this country is generally 264 to 916 nanograms, nanograms per deciliter. And that's considered a normal range. I think 264 is way too low for anyone that's healthy.
Right. Yeah, it definitely is.
That's kind of what doctors look at. It's like a normal range if you go to get TRT.
I can tell you I felt like shit when mine was like that. I'll get guys, though, that are blasting gear that'll see their free testosterone or total testosterone levels at 2,000 and they're disappointed it's not 5,000 from taking a gram of test.
But at a certain point, you're not able to use it, right? So
yeah, I'm like, it doesn't matter.
The best estimate that I've seen, and it does not apply, again, bodybuilders aren't really studied. The best estimate I've seen is that at any one moment in time, because so things are constantly binding to androgen receptors and releasing, and other things are binding, so it's constantly in flux, is that 3,500 milligrams is about the most that's usable by most people at any one given time. But again, that doesn't take into account a guy that's 280. Right. So who knows? That could be, it's possible a guy running Coleman size could use 10 grams of gear and actually have enough receptors for that, right? Because the more you use, the receptors actually upregulate.
Yes.
Right.
That is another bro myth that exists out there. Yeah, the whole you're down regulating your androgen receptors by exposing yourself. That's just an old bro myth.
Yeah, and then they get everyone, you got to come off because your receptors get dirty. Because if there's dirt inside of your cell in the cytoplasm, that's like clogging up everything. So the more androgen load the body sees, the more receptors it's going to make. So it has a place to put them. It doesn't like huge amounts of things floating around in your blood that don't have a place. Right. That's why it'll aromatize heavier. That's why it'll turn GHG heavier.
I think probably why guys made progress or whatever when they came off, or it's just simply because they're removing toxicity from the body.
Totally. Or we all have those, regulating factors too that upregulate after a period of time. Right. So if you're on gear for a certain period of time, and all the data in humans and in animals show that at like day 50 of a cycle, basically anabolism kind of stops and it becomes anti-catabolism, right? So you will still make progress because what matters for muscle growth is the balance between breakdown and,
positive.
And positive negative. So you're still going to make progress, but it seems that's like week 6, give or take. So most things are really starting to shift the way the body's working. So at that point, what most guys would do is then they'd either you have a couple options to downregulate things like myostatin. You could either increase the food or you can increase the drugs, or both. Right. I mean, generally guys, at least in my experience, will step things up, right? You'll step the food up a little bit, you step the drugs up, you step the food up, and that should obviously keep things moving, at least in a positive direction. That's the smarter way to do it versus just like bombard yourself with 3 grams of gear out of the gate.
Yeah, I mean, that's generally my methodology with people is I'll push up food, and when food doesn't work, then I'll push up the gear a little bit more.
Yeah, you go back.
It's this back and forth game, and just keeping an eye on body composition as well.
Yeah,
but that's typically how I program things, at least for myself.
And it makes sense. I mean, in nature, your body wasn't going to build muscle if it didn't find a reason for it, right? It needed food. If you don't constantly show more, basically just a reason to grow muscle, it's not going to continue just to grow. That's why we have this, obviously, because cavemen couldn't be 300 pounds. There was not enough food out there.
No. You hear that, carnivore guys?
Yeah. So anabolic effects versus androgenic effects. Anabolic effects are typically muscle, bone, and red blood cells. I think that's misunderstood. Certain steroids, like primobolan, was generally prescribed for anemia. It was still anabolism they were looking for, but it was more specifically like blood markers than it was muscle tissue, and then androgenic are what would be considered secondary, characteristics like hair on our faces, lack of hair on our head, genital growth, those kind of things.
Sounds like me.
Yeah, and aggression. Exactly. You're just androgenic.
I have hair growing out of my ears and not on my head.
Exactly.
All right, so let's talk about building cycles out. To me, it never, well, I mean, at least anymore, I used to run all kinds of crazy cycles. The more I think about it, it doesn't make any sense not to have a base of testosterone in a cycle. It just makes zero sense to me. And I get a lot of guys come to me and they want to tiptoe into stuff and start off with Debol or Anavar only. And I'm like, why not start off with the parent male hormone, see how you respond to it, and go from there. So what are your thoughts on building cycles out with a base of testosterone?
So I think one of the misconceptions is what testosterone's role is in the cycle, right? So if you're using testosterone only, which is what I advise anyone that's new at this would use because it's predictable,
right?
Is when testosterone is used in monotherapy, meaning used alone, it's going to provide both anabolism and androgenic things, and it's going to provide estrogen. But when testosterone is typically used, at least at a beginner to a moderate level of experience, it's really just there to supply estrogen, right? You would typically increase the testosterone to a dose that's manageable without crushing your estrogen, and then you would add another anabolic on top, like you always talk about.
Yeah.
The testosterone is really just serving at that point. There will still be some anabolism from it, but it's really just serving as a base of estrogen. When you get into more advanced cycles where the testosterone gets into the gram quantity, it's obviously driving growth as well, but it's still there for some level of estrogen. I think that's kind of like the easiest way to look at it. The guys are confused why the testosterone is there in the first place.
Yeah. So let's talk about estrogen just very quickly and its role in health and growth and all of that.
Okay. I mean, so estrogen, it protects your brain, right? Like I said before. So it's largely responsible for how males' brains are formed and function. It's kind of what actually makes us largely male, at least in our thought process. It protects your kidneys, protects your heart. To some extent, it's responsible for insulin growth factor 1, the conversion of growth hormone to insulin growth factor 1. If you have very low estrogen, most likely you're not going to produce a ton of IGF. It increases glycogen storage. It has a ton to do with growing. It's why it's better to be let estrogen probably run a little bit higher in the off season if you're trying to grow than trying to stay too dry all the time, right? I mean, sure, you've had experience with that in the off season.
Oh yeah. Yeah, if you're, I mean, you can just see it on contest prep. You're not growing on contest prep. No. These guys that talk about growing into shows, I just laugh. There's only one human being I know of that ever did it, and it was Kevin Levrone.
And he's literally 1 in a billion.
Yeah, I mean, it's just impossible. And also, like, I have to think about like the neuroprotection as well. So a lot of these dudes that ran nandrolone only cycles, a lot of them end up having mental health issues. You think of a guy like Mike Mentzer that completely went absolutely insane, and then ended up having running 3 grams of DECA only with no testosterone, and also ran into cardiovascular issues too. So, dude might still be alive.
And his brother Ray died of kidney failure.
Yeah, and
all three things that basically, right, estrogen protects.
Right. So that's an example. I know it's anecdotal, but that's an example of people that ran high nandrolone only cycles and probably killed them and likely contributed to Mike's mental health issues. Yeah. People got very upset when I talked about that, but anybody who knew Mike knew that he struggled with. No, he wasn't well. He struggled very mightily with mental health. I mean, he was hospitalized many times. And then the cardiovascular issues too. So the neuro, cardiovascular, and renal protective qualities of estrogen and not burying your estrogen. I get some guys that want to bury their estrogen in the off season and run AIs all off season. It's just not a smart approach. No. You want to limit that to just contest prep only when you're trying to get lean. And even now, like I'm not even running an AI right now, and I'm 9 weeks out. I'll save it until the last 6 to 8 weeks if I can get away with it.
Yeah. Yeah. It should be used like sparingly as needed, right? In an emergency, not so much just to manage. It's like, why would you take another drug that you're not getting anabolism out of just to manage the side effect of a drug you can't already handle? Right. Like lower your test if you can't handle it.
Yeah, lower the test.
And you and I both know this, the bigger and the leaner you get, the more tests you can handle without having an estrogen issue from it.
Yeah, I mean, I can run up to a gram now without
Yeah.
or even more without an AI.
Yeah, exactly. But when you first started, I mean, what was your top end? 400,
Oh,
500?
yeah, not even that. I think at 375, my estrogen would get up over 300 sometimes.
Yeah. And so estrogen also is technically a growth promoter on its own in men, at least. This is kind of where it's different. So activating the estrogen receptor actually aids in growth through other mechanisms. We could probably do a whole show just on estrogen if you want.
Yeah, and another aspect of that too, like the guys that, and I remember the whole Liver King scenario where he was running 12 units of pharmaceutical growth hormone in his
IGF was like a 200, right?
Yeah, it was even lower, I think.
150 or something.
But his estradiol was buried. It was puzzling to me that the doctor didn't put the math together on that. They just kept giving
most doctors don't know that, right?
Right. They just kept, he reached out. Well, the emails that got exposed, he was reaching out to people to try to understand why his IGF-1 was so low. And it was because he was running a shit ton of Winstrol, if I recall correctly, and his estrogen was buried.
What was he using for estrogen specifically? Do you remember?
Nothing. I didn't think.
Okay. Just the Winstrol.
Yeah, he was running Winstrol. I think if I recall, I could be completely wrong about it.
He was on DECA, very low test.
Winstrol, very low test, Winstrol,
very low test, like TRT.
Yes, like even like
a ton of IGF.
Yeah,
and a ton of growth hormone, right?
Yeah, I don't think there was IGF. I think it was just growth hormone.
Okay.
Winstrol, I think, is what he was running, and regardless, his estrogen was buried, and
you're not going to get much out of it. It's kind of
you're wasting your money on your growth hormone.
Yeah, basically.
Right. So it's not even if you're. That's another thing that people don't understand is that if you're taking HGH and you buried your estrogen from running, or even like if you're running an androgen only cycle, and you have no estrogen,
you might get some autocrine, right? Because nandrolone will help, autocrine IGF like in the muscle directly, but still you're better off just having some level of estrogen in general.
Yeah, I can speak from personal experience. I ran androgen only cycles and I felt horrible when I did them.
Yeah, and your estradiol was probably single digits at that point.
Yeah, it was like 8.
Yeah,
that's what it was, and I felt absolutely abysmal on it. I had no sex drive. I was flat.
Your mood, your joints probably start to feel a little funky.
Yeah, it was moody.
Dry.
And everybody always thinks it's prolactin, but it's nothing to do.
Very rarely do people really have prolactin issues. I think that's really
almost never. So circling back around, it is important to have a testosterone base, especially in your off season. Now we can argue on contest prep where you can probably pull it down, but you're right. I found that I stay fuller when I keep testosterone high.
Yeah, I definitely do as well. I would say, I think another misconception that I see a lot now that everyone of all ages is using the term TRT, right? There's 20-year-old guys that are on TRT.
Right.
I'm not really sure why that would be considered TRT. That's just a low cycle at that age because they're not really replacing anything it's missing. I think where the misconception, a lot of guys wonder if they get on TRT, if they're going to grow any muscle. Not to say that you wouldn't grow some, but it's been shown that if testosterone is the only stimulus for growth that's in you, like if you're not training specifically hard, your diet's not correct, testosterone would have to be over 1,400 nanograms per deciliter in your blood to cause growth on its own. So no actual TRT protocol is going to cause muscle growth per se, not on its own. I think the only thing that you would gain out of actual TRT versus being natural is you're not going to get the dips, right? You're just going to stay pretty much even, assuming you're using it correctly. That would be the only benefit I would see as far as muscle. We're talking about the real dose, like 150, 200.
Real dose. Yeah, I don't see. I mean, people will feel better. Body composition improves a little bit, but I don't.
There's benefits of TRT. I'm not against TRT at all. I just think that there's misconceptions about what it's very different than a steroid cycle. They're not. Not the same.
You're not going to turn into a open class pro bodybuilder.
No. And the standard is 300 milligrams is where it becomes super physiological, like greater than the human body can really ever produce. And that's kind of where TRT is typically capped at 250 because they're trying to separate the two.
Right.
Like when we study, the highest dose that we ever study in humans is 600 milligrams. Like we're very aware of what 600 milligrams does. We've never really studied above that.
I've studied above that.
Yeah.
Frequently.
Yes. Cool.
What I found with testosterone too, it just, it's funny how most everybody comes to the same conclusion. I just did a video about this the other day, but you'll see most pro bodybuilders, they end up in the same place where you'll see guys eventually come to the conclusion that it's testosterone base for your cycle and marry it with usually primobolan or equipoise.
Right? That it's coming from circle.
Primobolan, sometimes equipoise, you'll see guys run. Once in a while masteron, but usually it's primobolan or equipoise is what you'll see most pros run, and then HGH and insulin. That's sort of the holy standard. The standard for getting big.
When I think you said it in your video about pro cyclists yesterday, it's you get to a point where you realize that all the toxic stuff is really toxic and doesn't make you feel very good, and you're not getting any more growth out of it, right? Tren is not typically used in humans to promote growth. Like, it's not a fantastic anabolic, right? For that, like guys that I'm sure guys that run Tren pretty much year round, they never seem to get any bigger.
No, they don't. They stay hard and lean,
but they don't grow.
But they never get past 185, 190 pounds.
So I'm 100% with you on that. I think, and even if you could tolerate, like if someone could tolerate more testosterone, even testosterone growth hormone and insulin on its own would be technically enough to grow, right?
Right.
Minus that extra anabolic.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, but primobolan does have some modulation of estradiol as well. From what I understand, it's a reversely binding aromatase inhibitor.
Yeah. Yep. So Dr. Todd and I figured some stuff out a week ago, which we got to do a video on. Primobolan seems to act as an AI, like you said.
Yeah.
There's 16 new metabolites of primobolan that were actually just discovered this year. And one of those acts as an AI, and versus masteron actually acts as a SERM.
Yeah.
You're actually interacting with the estrogen receptor completely differently.
And that would make sense since it was used as a breast cancer treatment originally.
They didn't know that when the drugs were designed, that was just a fluke. It was they said, bro, that's alter DHT and see what happens. They couldn't have known that, right? They didn't understand enough about the molecules back then.
So my logic of running both primobolan and masteron together actually makes sense.
Yep. Yeah. Without destroying your estrogen.
Without destroying your estrogens. Yeah. That's typically what I do on contest prep. I'll run 1/3 of my dose would be testosterone, 1/3 would be primo, 1/3 would be masteron.
Okay. And you prefer that over just switching over to masteron fully?
Yeah, I have experimented with it. And the problem I run into when I just run masteron by itself is I flatten out.
Okay, makes sense. You get like this mineral excretion and stuff that occurs with, masteron, because it affects aldosterone and things like that.
Yeah, it seems. Although you can play around with the doses. Sometimes if I want to get a little bit harder, I'll push the dose up. But I was talking to John Jewett, and he said he runs just masteron with the testosterone and pushes the doses up pretty. As he needs to dry out, he'll push the masteron doses up higher.
No extra AI, right?
With no AI.
Okay. Yeah, but again, that's one, and there's nothing wrong with what he's doing, but that's also one person, right? It's like the average person walking this probably doesn't need to do what a pro bodybuilder's do.
Right. Right. Yeah, we're talking about performance enhancing. I have found that as I get towards the end of contest prep, that I do need to add an AI in to really harden up.
Yeah, at the end. It's interesting too, at least with the literature. Todd and I are going to test some of this. It seems too that using Arimidex actually doesn't impact IGF-1 the same as tamoxifen. So if someone were to worry about using GH and controlling insulin at the same time, they'd be worse off using Novadex or tamoxifen than they would.
Interesting.
Arimidex on its own technically raises IGF, at least in studies. So we're going to kind of test that out and see how that works in actual men that lift weights, not in women with cancer. Because that was always kind of an enigma. They were wondering why Arimidex was a great cancer drug if it actually raised IGF, right? Because cancer grows partially through IGF being elevated.
Right.
So apparently it's strong enough to block the receptor, so it would block the conversion, so it doesn't really matter.
Right. All right, Kurt, let's talk about dosing a little bit more. We kind of touched on it briefly, but for performance enhancement, you established that 250 is sort of the top end of 250 to 300 is the top end of TRT, and then we're getting into super physiological range. First time cycles, performance enhancement, what are we looking at?
I think a lot of guys start too high. I think the old school of thought with the 500 milligrams of test and then having D-ball on top of that for no reason. is probably not needed for a first cycle. I would typically say a beginner should be somewhere between 250 and 300, and then titrate up as needed. But I would think if you're a beginner and your food and your training are at least 80% on point, and you're not able to grow on 300 milligrams of testosterone, it's probably time to pick a different sport.
Yeah. Yeah, you'll know immediately.
600 or 700 milligrams of anything.
You've seen it with coaching people. You know immediately if somebody's a responder. If I start off usually like with 250, and then I'll kind of move it up to 375, and I've seen dudes absolutely blow up on just that.
Yeah, that's the genetic thing again, right? So you get that right away.
All right, Gym Bros, I'm going to interrupt this regularly scheduled broadcast to tell you about the new Science of HGH ebook by Kurt Havens. It is available on the Anabolic Bodybuilding website for download right now. There is a link in the video description below for the ebook if you want to pick it up. It is probably the most comprehensive ebook about performance enhancement use with HGH, over 100 pages of information with references, and it's awesome. Go check it out. So the upper limits of testosterone doses, it really, what I've seen, and you can chime in on this, it really depends on how big you are. We touched on it a little bit earlier, but like I definitely have a higher threshold for it now than what I did when I was 185 pounds.
The higher, I mean, I don't think it's unheard of to run 2 grams.
Yeah.
I would say there seems to be a point of diminishing returns after,
unless you chase irons and then run 3.5.
Yeah. I mean, it's not unheard of. I feel like there's some weird point of diminishing returns after a gram, right? It's linear to like a gram, and then it starts to flatten out a little bit.
Right.
And I think the only point to ever really go much above that is when you're chase irons, or, a pretty big dude who's run out of growth from anything else. I don't think someone who's 180 pounds, unless they started at 100 pounds, probably does not need to be running 2 grams of testosterone.
No. I mean, I am 280, 290 in the off season. The highest I've ever been is 1500. And I got up there this off season just for a few weeks, and it was too much.
Yeah. You feel
I felt sick. I just felt lethargic. I felt sick, and I pulled it back down to somewhere between a gram to 1250 seems to be the sweet spot for me.
I was going to say, that seems, I feel like for most guys, that's the high end, right? That's useful.
Now, that's not to say if you're 185 pounds just starting out that you should run a gram. That's not a smart approach. That's something you work your way up to. It wouldn't make any sense anyway. It'd be like eating 6,000 calories when you're...
Yeah, or benching 405 when you're new.
Right. So 0 sense. But it's a path that you work your way up over a period of years.
Yeah. And it should be, and that's also the reason why you want to start low, right? Because the more you use, the more you need in the future. So if your first cycle out of the gate is 600 milligrams, where are you going from there? Because the same dose isn't going to work more than a couple times, right? You're lucky if it works twice. So you're going to continually titrate up over time. So if you start that high, you're going to be using a bottle of test a week in your 3rd year of using drugs, and that can't be good for you at all. Right.
Yeah, and that's what I speculate, like a guy like Dallas McCarver, why he ended up at such crazy doses that he
started young and started high.
Started young and started high, and then you have no runway to increase. So my approach is always to get the most out of the least. And as we talked about earlier, move your food up, move your gear up, move your food up, make sure your training's on point. So it's a variable that you can consider in the equation, but it's usually the last one I adjust.
Yeah. And you taught me this. I mean, I always was slow to move my food up, be the last metric, and you really pushed the food with me, and that made a much bigger difference than anything else I ever did. I was just eating more of the right, not just quantity, the right food, right?
Right.
I mean, at this point, I'm eating, my high days are 1,500?
Yeah, something like that.
15 cups of rice a day.
Yeah, you're eating more than me.
Well, but I'm in my off season, so that should be.
I mean, even in your off season, you eat more than me. you just have a crazy metabolism. But yeah, the food, people underestimate the value of the food as a part of the equation. I honestly, and I'm off topic here, but this is sort of a controversial take. I've gotten to the point where I feel like the top of the equation as far as growth is food, then it's gear, and then training is at the bottom of the pyramid.
So I noticed this with my content being mostly, pharmacology stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting. I get a lot of interest in that stuff. People, they want to know the ins and outs of the drugs, but then those same people will DM me if I post anything about exercise, and they're completely confused about how to exercise. But yet they really need to understand everything that nandrolone does in the human body. But they don't understand what, the working length of a muscle is, or what mechanical tension is.
Yeah.
Right. It's maybe everyone needs to take a step back before worrying about the drugs and figure out the basic stuff first, right?
Yeah, I mean, I always tell guys, before you even consider a cycle, before you even go on testosterone, learn how to eat and learn how to lift.
Yeah, right. I mean, you and I probably touched on it before. I think there's a common theme out there. Guys will say things like, "Oh, you don't want to start steroids until you're 30 years old or something," right?
I'm not one of those hypocrites.
No, I think the key is what you just said. You don't want to waste. You only have so many cycles in you before you get sick.
Right.
Something goes wrong or your hair falls out. So you want to basically make sure that your training and your diet and your lifestyle is on point, and you have enough money to go see a doctor when things are wrong.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I also get messages from people all the time that things are very wrong, and they're playing doctor themselves, and they're adding things and removing things. And they want to know, but it's perhaps that's not a good time to be doing steroids.
I think the reason why I've had so much runway, because I've been on and off stuff for, it's embarrassing to say, but 25 plus years.
Yes.
It's because I did really small cycles when I was younger. Yeah. I didn't, I was push the food and push the training hard. And I don't think I ever surpassed until the last year a little over a gram total.
I was gonna say I never looked at your stuff as being excessive compared to what's out there.
Yeah. No, I've always been very conservative. I've tried, and I have pushed it a little bit more this year just to see, but I didn't really see huge additional benefit once you get past a certain point.
Yeah. And if you're on prep, that's the time to push it anyway, right?
Yeah.
The off season. The food should be doing most of the work in the off season.
There are some people that disagree with that, but I think prep is the time where you throw the kitchen sink at it a bit, but you can,
you're already going to be using dangerous stuff. So at that point,
Right. All right. Any parting words on testosterone? Any last words of wisdom?
Outside of, I think it should be the foundation of everything.
Right.
Any enhanced bodybuilder does. There's no reason to leave it out unless you really struggle with tolerating it. And
I think most of the time when people struggle with tolerating it, there are things you can do to modulate it. Yeah. Usually what I see, and I'm sure you can speak to this as well, Kurt, it's mostly estrogen issues that people have.
Yeah.
And you can modulate that with running some primobolan or something with it.
Or using less test, right?
Or using less test. That's always an option.
Yeah. But everyone needs to run 500 milligrams to start.
Right. So there are things that you can play with your ratio of testosterone to your DHT derived injectable. There's things you can do. All right, folks. Well, I appreciate you watching. Thank you, Kurt, for sharing your knowledge with us, and take care.
Yeah, thanks.
For coaching or consultations, head over to www.anabolicbodybuilding.com to book your spot today. I can help you with optimizing hormones, fat loss, muscle gain, physique, athletic performance, nutrition, and health. For more information, shoot me an email at bigp3rd@gmail.com.